hello everyone. My name is Rain. As I mentioned, I am the campaigns coordinator here at SBA. And we have Coco here as well from SBA, our programming coordinator, events coordinator. And we have Emma here, who is our ASL. I'm going to share screen now. If I get this right. Right. Everyone see my screen? Yes, amazing, great. So today is our session on climate change, disability, and eco-ableism. Fun topic. So this is our agenda for today. We're going to start with the land acknowledgements. I've already done a little bit of intro already, just to get a sense of, where you folks are in terms of this topic. We'll ask you some questions, and then we'll launch into talking about the language that's used in this topic, offer you some facts, go into a little bit more discussion, talk about some examples of ableism in these movements that we're talking about, go into some discussions if we have time, go into a break, and then talk about some of the actions that we can take. Okay. So as I mentioned already, we have our interpreter here. We have the subtitles, closed caption, and this session is recorded. So we want to make sure that we're acknowledging that we are gathered on sacred lands on the territories of the Huron-Wendat, Hatton First Nation, Seneca, and the Mississaugas of New Credit. This land is subject to the District 1's Bin-Wam-Pavel Covenant. It is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Anishinaabe and Allied Nations. This District 1's Bin Covenant demonstrates our collective responsibility to care for and share the land and its resources. And we are here because this land was and is occupied, and it is important for us to recognize this colonial history and present, to respect the Indigenous elders and ancestors and the stewards of this land, to honor our responsibilities to the land and recognize that we are all treaty people. If you'd like, you're welcome to type into the chat your relationship with this land as well, and speak to that, so that it's not just me, talking about the land, but we actually have a dialogue and talk about that. And you're welcome to turn on your mic to talk and introduce yourself, or you don't have to. There's no pressure to do that. Yeah. Anyone have any questions or comments so far? So most of you probably know what SBA is. We are a student-led nonprofit student group that advocates for inclusion, intersectional access, and equity. And we base all of our framework around a disabilities justice framework for all of our programming advocacy. We hold various workshops, events, and socials, games nights, movies nights, etc. We've done it in person before. Now, of course, we're doing it virtually. Hopefully, we'll eventually be able to go back to in person soon. And so my email is campaigns@uoftsba.com. You're welcome to follow us on our social medias. For our Instagram and Twitter, it's SBA Center, @SBA Center. And for our Facebook, it's UofT SBA Center. So first off, I just wanted to get a sense of how folks feel about this topic or understand this topic. So some questions that I had for you, what are some of the information that we know about or that you're aware about in regards to climate change right now? If you have any questions or challenges or concerns about the topic, and if you're open to sharing, you can choose not to, of course. What are some issues on disabilities or what is happening to our environment right now that you want to speak about or that you have questions on? Or if you want to talk about, oh, go ahead. You have a hand up. So I may not be able to see a chat if there's something going on in the chat. I don't know if Coco, would you like to tell us?
I don't see anything in chat right now.
Oh, okay. I saw someone had their hand up earlier. Maybe not. Oh, I see something in chat. Okay, they're gonna type. We'll wait for them to type their question and then we'll read out the question. But in the meantime, also, if anybody wants to let us know, even just why you're interested in this topic or joining us in this session, you're welcome to do that as well too. I know that for myself, when I started looking into this topic, there was a lot of information. I was quite shocked at how much information there was, unfortunately. And we'll get more into it, but essentially, it's difficult because we're on the one hand we're at a global crisis here, but we're leaving people behind, and some of the people that we're leaving behind are people with disabilities as we're trying to save our planet.
Hello.
I mean,
Sorry. You can go ahead.
No, go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm looking at these questions and it really is interesting because I'm usually the person that people go to not only get information, but to seek reassurance about the fact that people feel kind of doomed right now about climate change and the fact they are the ones being left behind. And I don't necessarily want to speak to the specifics of what I do know and maybe don't know. But in terms of issues and disabilities and what's happening with the environment, it's, for example, shortages in minerals and stuff like that is causing medical shortages all over the world, including, for example, hearing aid equipment or equipment that people with disabilities rely on to function, in regards to, for example, moving certain limbs or doing certain tasks. And it's really interesting to me that these things are not at the forefront of what a lot of people consider, because especially with the pandemic, more and more people need to rely on these things. So yeah, when we think about climate change and environmental stressors, I think it's one of those things where I try to reassure people that um, you know, the world isn't completely falling apart, but that yeah, we do need to be very considerate of the ways in which we use our environment around us and navigate the sorts of things that we have to come across and have to I guess, have available to us in our everyday lives. So those are just my thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Those are some very great points that you mentioned. Yeah. I want to go to the next hand as well too. You're welcome to either turn on your mic or you can type in the chat.
Hello. So one thing that I want to mention is with the ever increasing heat and temperature, you have people that like can't stay in the same temperature, like in the same area that they're used to living. For example, let's say you were to live in Texas and you were disabled in Texas, you don't necessarily have the means to get away from Texas, and like you don't have the money to move anywhere else. You just have to live with the heat and the exhaustion. And it's not necessarily like uh, sometimes water isn't available always either. And so you could always have like serious health problems as a consequence of the heat that may be occurring. And the opportunity to move away isn't always available. Just like if you're moving away to someplace that isn't disability friendly per se, not all locations have like wheelchair access, like for example, or they might not have ASL interpreters, or they might not be friendly to people with other disabilities. And so, like, it's very much a privilege to be able to move around places. And with the climate change, it's very like visible because the people that can move are people that are rich, and the people that can't and have to deal with the heat and the climate change and the consequences of climate change are people who are poor and disabled, who are unable to do anything about it.
Yes, absolutely. You raised a number of good points, and you raised some points that I was actually going to get into as well too. But both of you have raised some very good points, because it's astounding how they're not considering people with disabilities and all kinds of variations of disabilities when thinking about the this climate change, because as more and more issues pop up, there's a potential that more and more people will become disabled. So that the fact that we're not considering accessibility when it comes to these issues like emergencies, moving, emergency shelters, et cetera, that it's kind of interesting. And yes, the whole issue around money, and who has access and who is able to afford to have access is also one of the issues, right? So thank you for that. Oops. So I'm going to move on here. I can figure out. Oh, here we go. So one thing that I want to mention around terminology is that, even though here in North America or Turtle Island, we don't feel the effects of environmental changes as much because our weather is still fairly mild. Maybe not so much down in Texas, but it's very much far worse than other parts of the world. And some of these changes are much more drastic in many places around the world, including like floods and earthquakes and droughts in places like the Caribbean, Asia, and Africa, and which leads to mass migration on issues. So how we frame the communication really matters. So that's why I encourage us to use the word climate crisis rather than climate change, because we are in a crisis. Many people in other parts of the world are actually in a crisis. So I'm going to be sharing, some information, facts, and stuff like that. You're welcome to type into the chat or turn on your mics anytime if you have a question or comments. I might not be able to see it right away, but if Coco or somebody wants to nudge me and let me know that if someone wants to speak, then that's wonderful. But yeah, feel free to speak up anytime or not, if you like. So just to give us some stats, right? Globally, we have 253 million people who have visual impairments. We have 466 million people who are deaf or hard of hearing. We have about 200 million people who have some form of intellectual disability, and 75 million people requiring a wheelchair on a daily basis. So those are just some numbers. We have over a billion people with a disability, with approximately 15% of the world population living with disability, according to WHO. Within the next few decades, we're going to have 2 million people that will become climate refugees, meaning that over 15 million of them will be, over 50 million people will be disabled. So those are really big numbers, right? So how are people with disabilities included or excluded from the environmental justice movement? The impacts of how climate crisis has on people is often not something that we talk about. During the Hurricane Katrina in 2005, approximately 155,000 disabled people and elderly were affected, and half the deaths from the Hurricane Katrina were people over 75. And many of these people had disabilities and health conditions that increased their vulnerabilities. Oftentimes, and this might have been mentioned already, that during the natural disaster emergencies, warning alerts are often not accessible. Oftentimes, they may not be accessible for people with visual impairments or hard of hearing. And for those with mobility issues, oftentimes the quick evacuations can be extremely difficult, and not all of these shelters have access, are accessible. And in fact, a lot of people with disabilities are not even aware of emergency evacuation plans in their communities. And then even within the shelters, right, it lacks all kinds of necessary equipment and medication, like hearing aids and walkers and wheelchairs. So even if people do end up in the shelters, it's very, very inaccessible. And of course, when there is a power outage, it just becomes worse for people with disabilities with complex medical needs and not being able to access the power that they need for the medical equipments. So there was a bushfire in Australia where the accessibility needs were not considered. This included all the evacuation centers, the transportations, essential equipment that they needed to manage their health conditions. And the information were not in formats where people can read and understand them. So there was a study done by the United Nations in 2014 that people with disabilities are twice as likely to be injured or die during a crisis, and were less likely to recover one. So the climate crisis clearly disproportionately disadvantages people with disabilities. And we can see this even during the pandemic, where there was a really great article that I read about how people with disabilities have to take care of each other in ways that were very, very different from the suggestions that able-bodied people talks about. So there are three specific issues and outcomes that impact people with disabilities. We've got the limited access to resources, services, and knowledge about the effectively responding to the devastating environmental changes. Many people with disabilities often have compromised health, which makes them more vulnerable to the extreme changes in the climate crisis and ecosystem losses and the diseases. And people with disabilities are more likely to struggle with the evacuation or enforced migrations. So according to the UN survey, the cause of a high proportion of disabled people found to be injured or die during natural disasters was due to a lack of consultation with people with disabilities, leading to a lack of measures to support and protect them. We're going to come back to, after the break, we're going to talk about some of the things that we can do. So when environmental activists fail to take into account people who are less able or privileged, it is not sustainable, right? Eco-Ableism is often hidden in the spectacle and performance of positive, sustainable solutions. Many of these so-called positive changes to lifestyles that supposedly contributes to the minimization of climate change are often difficult, if not impossible, for people with disabilities. And I'm going to give you some examples of that as well. There's quite a few examples here on that. Actually, for example, there was a movement to ban plastic straws. I'm sure many of you have heard of this, but in reality, many people with disabilities actually need plastic straws because they have trouble with the bringing the cup to their mouth, and straws is an accessible tool for them. There was an initiative to have more people cycling to work, and while this may reduce carbon emissions, many people cannot ride a bicycle. So we need alternative ways to encourage people to travel. When we're talking about developing housing that is sustainable and environmentally friendly, oftentimes they may bring in all these cool technologies, but it actually creates a living condition that may potentially be road-free or car-free. And that's very difficult for people with disabilities because transportation is a huge issue in terms of being able to travel from home independently. It's quite essential sometimes to have multiple ways of traveling, including having cars. Banning cars doesn't actually make it more acceptable. Banning cars can potentially make it much more inaccessible for people. I'm just looking at the chat here. So Coco was mentioning that alternative to plastic straws may also be dangerous too, right? They may have splinter, they may cause issues with heat, and they're easy to break, and includes allergens and et cetera, et cetera. Thank you for bringing that up for us, Coco. So yes, for people with disabilities and wheelchair users, the door-to-door service would be needed in terms of allowing for travel to be accessible and allowing people to be able to travel independently. Banning cars, as I mentioned, isolates a lot of people with disabilities. So veganism is something that gets talked about, I'm sure, quite a bit. As well intended as it is, there are food allergies and sensitivities, access to certain types of ingredients, medications containing in animal products, issues with disordered eating and financial restrictions, all kinds of reasons why veganism is often very not accessible for many, many people. And there are other ways of, helping out with our environment and our animal population other than going vegan. Water and heating, I think someone was talking about the heating, right? With all the changes in the weather, both the heating and the water, right? Like some folks need to take baths rather than showers. And you'll notice that there's a lot of units nowadays where they don't include a bathtub and they just have a shower. And that is actually not accessible for some folks. And some people need to keep their houses warmer to maintain their health. So, keeping your house cold or turning off the heat isn't accessible for many people. As well, this goes without saying, I know lots of people who don't go to rallies, right? Because the activism that is done is very, very inaccessible. There's no wheelchair accessibility. There's no contingency plans for people who have issues with standing or walking. Oftentimes, people who are neurodivergent are not able to risk arrest, and oftentimes that gets forgotten. So sometimes direct action is considered productive, but it's also led by activists without disabilities and overlooks the need for accessible activism in favor of being productive and getting things done, which we can, get into, right? Like, what does it mean to be productive, and what values are we showing if all we want is productivity? So we have, we'll come back to this discussion because we are at the half-an-hour mark. So I want to make sure that we get a little bit of a break. Welcome back, everybody. So the next section I wanted to go over is what are some things that we can do, right? To take action or to make change, or suggest for folks, to educate folks, because people with disabilities have a right to a healthy, sustainable environment and must be included in the decision-making process regarding the environmental justice and protection of the environment. And we need to be able to challenge ourselves to be more creative when considering and designing sustainable solutions. For example, so funding at the intersections of disability justice and environmental justice needs to be given a greater priority. So putting into the funding to making things accessible, right? First of all, as mentioned before, consultation. Folks need to really do consultations with people with disabilities so that we can really identify the needs and the strengths of the local communities in relation to the environment, access to resources. For example, I can tell you that, as I mentioned, during the pandemic, I was reading an article about how the disabled community mobilized each other to support each other. Way back in the early times of 2020, when folks were hearing about the virus going around, people within the disabilities communities were already doing the research about the types of masks, and they were already ordering the mask, and they were already like talking to each other, asking each other what they needed, asking each other if they needed food and all that kind of stuff. It was quite astounding on how people with disabilities were able to kind of get the ball rolling because they knew that they're going to get left behind and that people are not going to actually take into consideration their specific needs. This specific community did a lot of work to support each other in terms of like mutual aid and offering each other support. So I think if we consulted with people with disabilities a lot more, we can potentially create an even safer and more universal care for and support system for us. So the next point here, creating accessible information and spaces where people with disabilities can learn and engage in the decision-making process regarding the climate issues, environmental policies. So whenever there are policies and this decision-making that's happening, consultations that's happening, all of it needs to be made accessible, right? The information needs to be accessible, and the spaces need to be accessible. You know, having consultation process or in spaces that are wheelchair accessible and that have interpreters, active listeners, etc., right? All of that needs to be taken into consideration. Funding to advocacy groups led by people with disabilities. I've yet to see an advocacy group, an environmental justice advocacy group that is led by people with disabilities, so that we can be advocating for disabilities justice, decision-making, and the rights at the policy level regarding climate crisis and environmental policies, right? You know, still waiting on that. Advocate for accessible disaster risk reductions to protect those with disabilities. For example, warning signs need to be made accessible. Escape routes and shelters all need to be made to accommodate people with disabilities. Evacuation plans need to be updated, again, through the consultations with people with disabilities. Digital activism, this is something that you know, we can benefit from looking more into, right? Especially with the way technology is now, online activism needs to be seen as a legitimate and worthy cause. I know that oftentimes politicians, when they look at petitions, digital online petitions, they don't take it as seriously. But sometimes online petitions are ways where more people are able to sign on, and people who, you know, can go and sign a petition in person, you know, still support the cause, and these need to be taken into consideration. Activists of all abilities need to be able to use the online spaces to spread their messages and participate in activism in whatever ways they're able to. As much as it is important to make online activism accessible, it is important and to remember that all activism actually needs to be accessible, right? So when we're having rallies and protests and talks, we need to make them accessible and make that a priority. And you know, ask people with disabilities what they want you to do. Provide the transportation, the support and solidarity. Creating accessible spaces in activist situations allows for people with disabilities to be out in the world and to be seen. So, yeah. Does anyone have any comments so far? Okay. I'm just looking at my script. I'm not looking at my phone here, although I am looking at my phone. So there's a comment here by Coco. If anyone attended Pride events, you'll remember we discussed a lot of these issues. Yes. So earlier back in June, we had our Pride event, and we have talked about the accessibility or inaccessibility of many events that are out there in person. When when there are gatherings of large groups of people, it tends to be that those situations and those events are not particularly accessible. So here's a quote: inclusivity and sustainability are inextricably linked. When we talk about sustainability, if you're not being inclusive, or if you haven't thought about the different types of embodiment, then you're designing in a way that's going to exclude a large proportion of the population, who are either overlooked, omitted, othered, and forgotten about in a great deal of areas of social participation. And this is something from Professor Simon Darcy, who co-leads the UTS Disability Network at UTS Business School. So that's all that I have to share. I'm going to stop sharing now so we can launch into discussion. So after hearing all that, anyone have any comments, questions, thoughts? Yes, go ahead.
I do have one thought. In terms of events also, with the current COVID situation, a lot of people are immunocompromised as well, so they might not be able to come out at all. So that's another thing that people should be aware of when holding events too.
Yes, absolutely. I know that there is some people with disabilities who are expressing how now that we're opening up more and the city's opening back up more, they're feeling being isolated and excluded once again. So yes, definitely with the COVID situation, we need to, and this is a good opportunity actually with the COVID situation for us to kind of consider how we can make events and everything more accessible. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I just also wanted to hop in and give just an actual example that happened with accessibility for meetings. Is that at part of the University of Toronto Union for workers and staff had a general meeting discussing if they wanted to have in-person meetings again. And a lot of people agreed that having them online meant that they could attend them for the first time, or they were much more likely to go, and that attendance had increased dramatically.
Yeah, yeah. I think what's challenging for some people is that with able-bodied folks is that there needs to be a change of the way that they envision our world, in that the way that we interact with each other needs to expand and needs to include the technology that we have. I can give an example that was very, very powerful. I was at an performance art show over the weekend. One of the performers was my very first performance art teacher when I was like just a wee 17-year-old. I took a performance art class, and my teacher was part of that show. It was her and another artist that were doing the show, and both of them have visual impairment, and so her friend, the other artist, was just talking about how she uses her phone to take a picture of what she sees, and then on the phone she can enlarge it so that then she can actually see what's happening. And my teacher, who recently started losing her sight, was just blown away by the fact that, oh, you can take a picture of it and then you can blow it up and then you can see it. And she was so moved that she was like crying because now she can actually see things that she takes pictures with. And so this just goes to show how like we have the technology to make things so much more accessible than we could have. And it really changes lives when we consider making things accessible for folks. Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, sort of jumping off of that, what comes to mind for me is that we have been asked to adjust back to different environments very, very quickly. Um, and it's really strange to me that there is no sort of lead back in because, for example, farmers are being asked to work in specific places again, and being asked to work at the same rate as pre-pandemic without the acknowledgement that like, hey, the environment here has changed, the soil has changed, the weather and the climate has changed. And we can see that on other scales, for example, in an urban environment, being asked to suddenly go back into the office again, being asked to go back to an inaccessible environment and to do work there as if you are still doing it at home, and to do that with the same sort of efficiency, which is possible for some, it's possible for some people, but totally impossible for others. So it's not only the fact that like we are being asked to go back in person, but that we are being asked to give up a lot of the accommodations and being asked to give up a lot of the things that made, living in pandemic possible. And also just learning that like, oh yeah, these places were never built for us. Like they were so commonplace before, but now that we're going back, we're starting to notice, oh, these stairs are really hard to climb, or like this elevator is really cramped and I can't like move properly in it, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think there is a weird sort of thing where it's like it's not necessarily that people, don't want to go back into doing things quote unquote normally, which is bad anyways, but it's just also like the speed at which we're being asked to move back into environments that like were inaccessible before and are still inaccessible.
Yeah, you raised a number of good points there, right? It's almost as if like we want to pretend like the pandemic never happened and just go back to what we were pre-pandemic, which is quite unpractical and unrealistic, right? Because so we have learned so much about ourselves and what we need and what humanity needs during the pandemic. Why are we not taking the lessons that we've learned and using it, right? I remember coming across, I was trying to make some surveys, and I remember coming across certain surveys around people's thoughts on going back to the office, right? Versus working at home. And it's been clearly shown through many of the surveys that a lot of people actually want the hybrid mode. A lot of people want to have the option of working at home now, especially since we have the technology for it. So why are we not considering that, right? And why are we not considering having more meetings that are virtual instead of just trying to push everyone back into doing things in person at the rate that we did before? Again, this whole productivity thing, right? But I question how productive we are, if people are doing things that they don't want to. So yeah, so those are really good points. And I see another hand up, so go ahead.
Yeah, to bring another dimension into it as well, a lot of people have been speaking about how many fewer microaggressions. Yeah, there's a lot fewer microaggressions that they experience in the workplace when they're working remotely versus in person. And there are other examples, such as I was in a class and they wanted everyone to be on camera. And one of my classmates was like, hey, give me like 10 minutes. I have to go put my headscarf on. And other situations like that, where the ability to work from home gives people a lot more freedom from other people's opinions and scrutinizations and stuff.
Yeah, yes. And so that's why you know, the way I envision is how we can, because there are some folks who really do need the in-person contact. So how can we make it so that, and we have the technology to make it possible so that the people who want to work from home, who need to work from home, can work from home. And then those who need that in-person contact can still be in person. And it's absolutely possible for us to do that. We've had hybrid meetings, right? So it's possible. It's just a matter of just doing it, right? And keep doing it and adjusting things until it works. So just reading some comments in the chat, right? Going back to normal is such a wild idea to me, especially since normal wasn't great, right? Whatever normal was before the pandemic, it wasn't great for a lot of people. Certainly, I discovered how much more benefits I can get from working at home. So yeah. And I'm just looking at time here. We have about 5 more minutes. Anyone have anything else that they'd like to raise, talk about, chat about? I was thinking about, as I was reading over some of the actions that we can take, I was thinking about, you know, how we can apply and push people to fund movements and causes that are led by people with disabilities more. Especially because Ontario has a deadline of 2025 to have all buildings meet the AODO standards. I find that so interesting. We have 3 years to have all the buildings in Ontario meet the AODA standards. Blows my mind. We need to get on it.
Yeah, Rain, I don't know if you also want to share, such as like the BSWD right now as a segue.
So yes, BSWD, it's short, but essentially it is about the funding that students with disabilities can potentially apply for. And there's 2 streams. There's one for permanent disability and one for temporary disabilities. We are going to be having a workshop for that coming up soon, very soon. So definitely stay tuned for that. You know, further studies. My connection is being unstable right now, so I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm told that my connection is a little bit unstable. And Coco has very kindly posted a link in our chat regarding the funding. And yeah, it looks like it's frozen, but you can definitely check it out. Any last minute thoughts for the last few minutes that we have? So there's a question here. Does anyone have good resources on anything they can share that explores this topic more? Yeah. There was, you know what, there was one more screen here, I believe. And if people want, I can share these slides to you and send these slides to you. There is a further reading this article. This was a very interesting article, and that's why I posted it. Again, I can share the slides, or I can send you the slides so you can look up this article. There are some really, really fascinating pieces that are being written about the parallels between colonization and disabilities, and how colonization has like kind of created like the disabilities. Yes, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Emma, for coming.